Hi, I'm Lori.
And I'm Kevin, and this is No Longer Ashamed.
We are survivors of childhood sexual abuse.
And we're here to share with you that if you're a survivor, you don't have to be alone.
Our logo is a salamander, and the reason is a fire salamander can survive a fire, and you have survived a fire.
We want to help you with your journey to healing and hope.
We are all survivors together, and we walk this journey together, and you are not alone.
By telling our stories, we are hoping that you will have the courage to share your stories as well and find your voice.
Because stories are so important, and for so long I know that I wouldn't tell my story, but when I finally shared my story, that's when I got my freedom.
And this is our journey and your journey to healing and hope. So come with us.
We are so glad today to have a panel with us of people you'll remember from other podcasts. I wish you could see this video, Zoom, because we have Santa, Mike Chapman. Welcome, Mike.
Hi, guys.
And then we have our good friend Luke, who was also on an episode. And since then, he and Mike have become connected because of the podcast. Welcome, Luke.
Thank you, guys. I'm glad to be here.
So, and of course, we have Kevin also on the panel for today where we'll be talking about shame. And just this last week, I interviewed a woman who's a trauma specialist, Dr. Shauna Springer. And you may have seen on our Facebook, I posted a snippet of it. Mm-hmm. And she was talking about, I was telling her that I thought maybe it was different for men than women. And she said, as women also have this thing with shame because their body reacts in a way that they don't want it to. Mm-hmm. And so I thought that was really important. And so maybe that's something we can touch on too. So I don't know. I think what we'll start with is just a little bit of who you are, a little brief bit about your story to remind people. And then after that introduction, we'll go through. We'll just talk about shame. So Kevin, let's start with you and tell us, who you are and a little bit about your story briefly in 10 seconds. No, it's kidding.
A brief history of Kevin. Yes. Well, I did this podcast because I'm a survivor and I wanted to get into voiceover. And I thought, well, actually, Lori thought a good way would be to start doing podcasts. And I couldn't think of anything to do a podcast about except I knew male survivors don't really have a voice. And I wanted to give men a voice and to share my story of surviving and healing of the abuse. So I started this podcast and we've been doing it for over a year now. Well, it's close to a year. I think we started about a year ago. Yeah. And this is my favorite subject, shame. And we're doing this panel about, I think what is the hardest thing for men who are survivors is the shame of being a survivor. And that's why we decided to have other survivors on as a panel to just share what it's like. And I think, it's different for men and women, but it's also, there's a lot of the same issues. It's just we deal with them differently. I think men and women deal with our issues differently. And that's why I wanted to do this podcast with you, Lori, is that we have the issues, but men do things differently than women. And that's why it's so hard for men to talk about it. So that's why we're here.
One of the things that we hear a lot, people say they don't think they can listen because they feel like it's too heavy. And, it's like, well, we do laugh. We try to find humor wherever we can.
Well, it's all about the hope. And that's where the healing comes in, is there is hope. You can get through this. It's not easy to get through it, but when you get through it, there is the hope of actually living the life that you wanted to live.
Yeah. So Mike, Santa, tell us a little about you.
Well, I probably need to explain why you keep calling me that, because I know it wasn't until after the episode aired this past fall, and then I actually was able to move into a role as a part-time professional Santa Claus. But backing up to the history that I shared on the podcast, I was abused by my father at an early age. It actually turns out it was actually as an infant, then continued until I was about 5. He then trafficked me to other men until I was 8. And also in college, I was sexually assaulted by a Methodist minister. Yeah, and everything other than what happened with the minister, they were all repressed memories until my 30s initially, and then the trafficking and the early abuse as a infant. Those things were discovered just a few years ago in therapy and through my journey, as you would. And then through my recovery, I got asked to do a temporary Santa gig because I already had a long beard. So I did it for a one-day thing in 2019. And the mall was so impressed that when 2020 hit, they couldn't negotiate terms with their normal Santa provider as far as safety concerns and so forth with COVID. So they said, hey, remember that guy we had for that one day? Let's see if he wants to do it permanent. So I did. Originally, it was a signing Santa thing. So they brought in deaf children and so forth for that one-day event. But then I just became the permanent mall Santa for 2020, and they've asked me back again for 2021. And yeah, that was a whole other story that goes perfectly with the theme of shame and overcoming the shame. It's like, can I really be this person, take on this role, knowing my own background? So
thank you. Thanks, Mike. And Luke, tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, so I was abused when I was 16 by a female quote unquote friend. I wouldn't really say she was a friend, but just an acquaintance, really. And that continued for about 2 years, 16 to 18. Once I hit 18, I would say I aged out, right? So once I aged out, she no longer had interest in me, which, really showed me what she cared about. Shame is not my favorite subject, but it was something I've dealt with a lot. So, it's going to be a great panel.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Luke. And what I really appreciate is all of your honesty and saying things that are hard to say, because these are the conversations that get stuff down. And I believe when people hear this, it will help them go, oh no, I'm not alone. And like some people we've interviewed, they didn't even really realize it was abuse until they saw it on like Law and Order or Bull or whatever. They're like, oh, I didn't realize, I didn't like it. I hated it, but I didn't have a category for it. I'm going to read the definition of shame: a painful feeling of humiliation or distress caused by the consequence of wrong or foolish behavior. And I've often heard that guilt is I did something bad, and shame is I'm bad. And I think when you're abused as a child, and even 16, Luke, is still a child, we don't have the brain capacity to separate and understand. And we're often told things, it's your fault, or no one will believe you, or other things that we've talked about. So I thought, let's just, whatever comes to mind first, and then we'll expand on it. So Luke, I'm going to ask you to go first since you're so uncomfortable.
It's not uncomfortable, but when you read that definition and you were talking about that just now, what came to mind was that's exactly how I felt. Was this is all my fault, and it's something to be ashamed of, and it's not something actually to be ashamed of. It happened, yes. It's a hard subject to deal with, but the fact that I'm dealing with it that's the main purpose, right? That's the main thing right there, is I'm dealing with this, and I'm going through what I have to go through to deal with it. And I can say when it happened, my body reacted in a way that I didn't want it to react, obviously, And someone had previously asked me about this, how can it be rape when, and I said it's rape because as a male, your body is going to react to that sexual stimuli. And it's going to cause you to become erect, whether you like it or not. That's what's going to happen. And to me, that was something to be ashamed of. But as I've grown older and I've gone through this process, it's become something of, it's not something to be ashamed of. I can look at this, I can research this, I can understand why it happened the way it happened, why that happened. And there's, I think, medical research on it, on why this happens when a male is assaulted. like this, or abused like this rather. But as far as shame goes, I dealt with that shame for many years. 16, I didn't tell anybody. At 16, I didn't tell anybody till I was over 30.
Mm-hmm.
And it was because I was ashamed. It was because I was afraid. And I think when I think about it now, that shame played a big part in why I was afraid. How are people going to look at me? How are people going to think about it? And I had mentioned this in the previous podcast, people saying things like, oh, you just wanted it or whatever, because they have this perception of males and of rape, and that males cannot be raped, that males can't have this happen to them, which has been proven time and time again that it can. The shame played a part in everything in my life. My drug abuse, because I was so ashamed, that I turned to drugs. And again, not an excuse, but the truth, and drinking. My hiding from the world, because I was so ashamed of this. So afraid of what people were going to think.
Yeah. And that shame seems to bring about the fear, right? Because
correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Well, it does.
First of all, I can't believe you're over 30. I've always been thinking you were like 25, but I think we may have had that discussion before.
We have.
I posted something the other day. The average time it takes for somebody abused as a child to tell is 26 years. Mm-hmm. So good on you that it only took 10, 16, whatever it ended up being, right? But it is. And I think that's why shame is so powerful, because it keeps us in this small bubble where we can't live our life because of it.
Yeah, and that's why I call it the hidden enemy, because we want to hide our shame. We don't want others to know about what we're ashamed of. So we hide it and we keep it from everyone, but we're trapped by it. Because we hide it, we can't share what we're hiding from everyone else. And that's what keeps us from healing, is the hiding. I mean, even today I went to see some friends and my brother was there and we were gathering together. Some of us hadn't seen each other for years, literally 10 years. And I had to leave early. And I just basically said, yeah, I've got to go. I've got to be home. But I didn't tell them what I was coming home for, because they don't know I'm doing this podcast. Some of them aren't even aware that I'm a survivor. And I just didn't want to bring that in to that gathering, to that conversation, because we were just getting together. We were just reuniting. It had been years. We're kind of catching up. And this will be something I will bring up eventually. And some of them do know about, but not all of them. And I just didn't want to lay this topic down, because like you said, Luke, it's not an easy conversation. It's kind of a party downer, It's kind of way to, kill the buzz at a party. I'm doing this podcast tonight, so I gotta get home. Oh, what's the podcast? Well, it's about survivors. It's just not something you talk about all the time, but it's something we need to talk about at the right time with the right people, so we can get to a place of getting over that shame, getting past the shame and realizing it doesn't belong to us, that we are not defined by what happened to us. That's my main stronghold right now, is I'm not defined by this. It's something that happened to me, but I'm beyond it now. But shame is, I think, the hardest thing for male survivors, especially because very few male survivors ever talk about it. No one's really, we hear about them. We hear about what's happened in all these different things with the Boy Scouts, with the Catholic Church, with the other churches like you, Mike. But generally, when we hear from or hear about male survivors, it's because they become perpetrators in some manner. And we hear about them and then we go, oh, well, they were a survivor, so of course they turned into a perpetrator. And that's the problem, is that's only partially true, but that's what is talked about so much. that's what we hear about so often. And so this rest of us survivors who aren't perpetrators, who don't continue the cycle, we're afraid to talk about because we don't want to be labeled in that way.
Yeah. An interesting thing you brought up is the shame doesn't define us, but what we as humans do, our brain, we tell a story. And so we tell ourselves the story, and then we begin to assume what others will think. And for women, others tend to be compassionate. For men, they, like Kevin said, they are more likely to judge or assume. So I think that that makes it hard, because then we're telling a story. We don't really know it's true, but then that, it perpetuates us not speaking about it. And so it's being brave and courageous to face who we are and to be able to say the words, which we'll talk about more later. Mike, you want to tell us about your thoughts?
Well, for me, my story was a little different because when it happened to me as a child, I was sedated. So any kind of physiological response would have been reflex responses. And from what I understand, that's kind of the drawing point for men reaching out to children of that age because of those reflex reactions. And very sad, very scary, but very true. And with the minister, it didn't get far enough for me to have a reaction, though he touched stuff, but I was extremely repulsed and was able to get him to leave. So that's not a part of my story as far as the physiological reaction, but shame is a huge part, just because you feel so dirty, so unclean because of what took place, and you feel so unworthy to do anything. Plus, oh my gosh, if someone found out, and men don't talk about it. So the only stories you hear are women, girls, whatever, but never men. And I was blown away by the statistic of 1 in 6. 1 in 6 men are sexually abused or assaulted before the age of 18, according to CDC. And that's in the US, and that just was amazing. And I think those numbers are low, that they're probably even a higher percentage.
Yeah, that's just an estimate, because they don't know how many men actually, because it's so underreported.
Right. And I heard that they interviewed perps why they tend to go after boys. They said boys don't tell. That was one of the drawing factors, which is also scary. But yes, it's like once I started dealing with all this, okay, how much do I share? And what if people find out? And then the whole thing, are they going to think I'm an abuser too? And like be afraid for me to be around children? And, all of that was so true. And I love being around children, and I raised 2 children myself, and I would never dream of doing anything like that. But that fear was always there. And yeah, just feeling so dirty, so unclean, that kind of cloud hovered over me for a long time. And it's taken just these last few years of deep recovery, getting over that and being able to share my story, realizing if I share, I can help others. And why not share, and then, okay, well, then I'll share it. I still haven't shared it. Like, I'm not posting stuff on my public Facebook page. I don't go there yet. And I've got family members who were abused as well, and they are kind of part of my story, but I know they don't know I'm doing this, and I don't want to hurt them. So I'm kind of having a balance with that. But I want to put my story out there and let them know. Yeah, let other men know you're not alone. There's help out there, and it was not your fault. And there's healing. There's so much healing available for all of us. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Dr. Springer said something that was really powerful. And I think women get this a lot, what were you wearing? Did you say no? Did you fight back? And I think for women, we're like, he was bigger than me. But for men, I think there's that kind of inbred thing that you're supposed to be the strong one and, and the protector. And so when you're violated, that messes with all of those connections. Does anybody want to say something about that?
For me, it was, I was so young, I really had no defense, and I had no words to even tell anyone what happened. The whole statute of limitations is a joke because, if you're 4 years old when you're abused, if a statute is 7 years, you're 11 years old, you're supposed to report that person. You're barely even, you don't know who to talk to about it. And at the time it happened, I was so young, I couldn't talk to anyone about it. I had no one available. I had no resource. And when you're older, this person was a part of my normal relationships, and I didn't necessarily want to turn them in. And that's the other thing I think that is often misconstrued, or people automatically say, well, why didn't you turn them in? Why didn't you call the police? Well, you don't. If you have a relationship with them, depending on how that relationship is, you might not want them to go to jail. That might not be what you want out of this. And that's really difficult because child abuse is so horrific for so many people. They think, oh my gosh, anyone who abuses a child should be thrown in jail for the rest of their life. Well, that's not always the best solution or what you as a survivor want. And so that makes it really difficult too. And I was also abused later on in life, and I had blocked it out. I had completely, and I think it was because I knew what was happening. And so your body knows how to shut things out. You learn that when you're abused. You learn how to compartmentalize, how to disassociate. And I did. And so I still don't remember that well. But again, going to the police wasn't the solution there either. Even though you wonder, did that person continue to abuse? Well, I don't know. I really don't know. Yeah. So I think there's a lot of problems about shame. Not only do you feel dirty, do you feel like you've done something wrong, like learned something that you shouldn't have known, but you also don't know what to do with that. And I didn't know how to address it until later on, until I was in my, late 20s, early 30s. And at that point, there is all this stigma attached. If you talk about it, then people are going to think, well, survivors always turn into perpetrators. So you don't want to tell anyone that you've been through that because they're going to assume you're going to be one of them. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's been a long, and I really want to emphasize that talking about it actually helps you to get past that stigma, to realize that it wasn't your fault. You didn't deserve this. The shame isn't on you. It's on whoever did this to you. And there is healing. It takes work, though. You really, as we can all attest, it's not easy, but it's so worth it. It will change your life.
Yeah. And I think we'll talk more about that story aspect coming up, Kevin, because I think that's really important. Mm. But Luke.
Yeah. So couple things. So after I did the first podcast with you guys, I actually had got past that stigma. I'm not afraid now to be like, it's like, I don't, it's not like it's something I bring up in casual conversation, obviously, but, if someone's talking about rape and they think it's funny or whatever, I'll be like, look, I'll take them to a side first and I'll be like, look, I'm a survivor. I don't think what you're doing is funny. I don't think what talking about it is funny and laughing and joking about it is funny. It's something that some people go through. Mm. And yeah, there's a stigma about it. Yeah, there's people who joke about it, but it's not something that's funny. It is harming to that person to have that happen to them. And I wanted to touch on something Mike said as well. My story as well has someone else, another victim, and I won't say his name, but and with him, it got to the point where I watched him attempt suicide. And I do want to say, if you do get to that point, get help. Definitely get help, because there's shame. Yeah, there's going to be that shame. But it's definitely not worth that either. That's just a permanent fix to a temporary problem. Mm-hmm. That this life, being able to help people is what this is about. And once you do get past that stigma, it's amazing to be able to help people, being able to know there's ways you can help change somebody's life for the better who's dealing with the same issues. And Mike and I connected really well. And I think one of the big things that helped us connect is that we're both obviously we're both survivors, and being able to connect on that front. And I can contact him like, hey, Mike, this is what I'm dealing with. I'm having an issue, and maybe he'll be able to talk me through it. Maybe not. I don't know. I haven't gotten to that point yet, thankfully. But if it happens, it happens. It's a community. of us were, and I think I had said it in the text or on the messenger, we're a family.
Yeah. And I love how you used our Facebook to reach out to Mike, because Luke and I were talking and I said, I put up Mike's video. And so Luke really liked it. I said, reach out to him. And that's what we really hope for our Facebook, that people will reach out, and any of us that are available are happy to have a conversation. And I know at first it's scary, but it's safe. And, so that was so great. I see a lot of dogs on here tonight. Mike has something to say.
I wanted to add to what Luke was saying. I did have a family member who was a co-victim, and they did eventually end their life with suicide several years ago. Yeah, so there is so much shame, and if you don't deal with it, find healthy ways to get through it. It's extremely difficult.
Yeah.
So.
We've talked a lot about telling our story, and it's hard to tell because there's shame. And I've often shared, when I finally shared a teeny bit of my story, it was with Kevin's wife, and it was before cell phones, and I must have called her 10 or 20 times. You're not going to tell anyone. I mean, I felt so vulnerable and so scared, and it was later that I realized how important that was for me to get those words out in a safe environment, even though I had to keep trying to control it. I mean, she was never going to tell anyone, but I had to be reassured over and over. But that was, I would say, the start of my healing, when I was able to say the words. Kevin?
Yeah, that's where it started. I never wanted to even talk about it. I never intended to talk about it until someone else told their story, and my friend at the time didn't believe her, and I had to say, well, I believe her because I'm a survivor. I mean, I don't know if I ever would have talked about it. And until I started talking about it, I didn't realize that it was something I needed healing from. All my life, I just thought it was something I was going to run away from. I was going to hide. And that didn't work. That's why I had to go to drugs and alcohol, because they worked. But they only worked as far as just numbing myself, hiding all my feelings, bottling it up. And that only works so long. And I think that's why there are so many people that finally can't take it, because, you can only hide it for so long. Then it does start to define your life. Yeah. And that's why going through the process and getting the healing will make you realize we don't have to be defined by that. We allow it to define us if we try to hide it, if we try to bottle it up. It remains, that hidden secret that we don't let anyone else know, but that controls us. But if we bring it out to the light and work on it, then it doesn't control us anymore. But we have to bring it out. You can't hide it.
If you've ever heard of Brené Brown, she talks so much about shame. And what happens is when we have shame, then we're acting out of shame, and our relationships are based on that because we're responding maybe defensively or because of our shame. And so it's not until we start to let go of that and realize that's not who we are. It's something that happened, and we can forgive or not. I'm all for forgiving because it's really about us, but that it isn't who we are. But until we make that connection, that's how we're going to act, like we are so unworthy and we're so, whatever the shame is, dirty, unimportant. And I mean, I always gave up the front seat, took the back seat, took the last thing. I never felt that I was worthy because I was so disgusting was the word that came up for me. So I think that when we begin to tell our story is when things start to shift. And so for Mike, he remembered something happened and he did something about it and started his healing, but then he remembered something. So there are stages and phases, and it's not the same for everyone, but I think Mike was able to deal with the second part, which was really the first part of his story, because he did something. He took action in the first situation, which was so brave. And so let's talk a little bit about what happened when we started to tell our story, because I think I want people to hear what happens when you tell your story.
Right. I guess actually it was spring of 2019, I started my whole recovery journey over again. I watched the Leaving Neverland documentary on HBO, and they talked about the two survivors of that and interviewed them. And I was just so struck by their stories that it really inspired me. Yeah. It was like God saying, yeah, you need to work on your stuff again. So that's when I realized, yeah, I had friends ask me to go to Celebrate Recovery meetings. So I started there, and also malesurvivor.org, which was recommended on, I think, the Oprah special. After that, Leaving Neverland, they talked about that group, and that was phenomenal. Reaching out to other survivors, seeing how many parallels we had in our stories, and then getting information that's like, oh, well, I have PTSD. I get treated this way and this method. It's like, really? Do you think I have PTSD? It's like, oh, yeah, you probably do. It's like, oh, okay. All right. Well, and then, yeah, going back to therapy and saying, hey, do I have the PTSD? It's like, okay, well, let's find out. Let's get a PTSD specialist, which I did, and started digging into these issues. And then any way I could find ways of healing. And I think dealing specifically with the shame, I had gone, after I did the interview with you guys, I went to it's Marked Men for Christ. They lead Christian men's retreats all across the country, very intensive, just shy of 48 hours weekends, that just phenomenal. But they deal with tons of inner healing work, and I was able to share my story, and everyone went, you go very deep very quickly. And they emphasize safety and so forth. And one of the things at the end, they kind of give words of knowledge that they don't even really know. They know, some of them don't even know your story. And you hear things, and they just impacted me so deeply, and it's stuff that I needed to hear. One had a vision of a waterfall, and that I was under the waterfall just being cleaned. And he said, he has washed you clean forever, meaning God. And that just hit me so hard. And then I went to another person who says, you don't need anything else. His word is final, not knowing what the other guy had shared. And it was just because I kept searching. It's like, I feel so dirty. I felt so unworthy. I felt that cloud of shame. And it's like, he cleaned you already a long time ago. Don't worry about it. It's done. And it was like just so freeing to hear those words. I know we don't have video, but I'll show it to you guys. It's a picture of a waterfall. I have this sign hanging up in both my offices here. I work from home as well, but it's a big waterfall. And then I have those words. He has washed you clean forever. You don't need anything else. His word is final, to kind of remind me, I am clean. I don't have this cloud of dirtiness that I need to carry around with me anymore. I am clean. I can do things. I can work with children without shame, without fear, because that isn't me. It doesn't define me. And to be able to have that shame lifted away, that was huge. And I think that was the final thing, just being at that event, which then built on all the other recovery stuff I had been to from that at that point, including sharing my story. Huge, just huge in helping me overcome the shame. And then knowing, that Christmas I was asked to do that one Santa event, and then it just snowballed. And I felt so comfortable and so worthy to do it. I did not feel that cloud of shame. It allowed me to be successful at it enough where they asked me back.
That's so beautiful. And one thing is, I hope you would post that, take a picture and post it to our Facebook page, because it's so beautiful. Two things that I noticed. One is that the freedom you feel, but that you told your story, you still were struggling. And then you wrote down those words so you could look at them every day, because our brain goes to what's familiar. And so when we've lived in shame for so long, it wants to go back there. And so by looking at that every day and saying that, putting it in all your offices, then all of a sudden that becomes familiar. So when you start to have those feelings, you're like, no, I'm clean, right? And so that's the hard work. When we keep saying it's hard work, that's the hard work that we do. So thank you for sharing that, Mike. Kevin, you look like you have something you want to say.
Well, I'm just so thankful that you are in that place where you're comfortable with kids. You feel that shame lifted off you, and you're able to do what you've wanted to do, and you don't feel like it's an issue anymore. Because I know for me, it was hard to get to that point. It took me a long time to get to that point where I could feel like it wasn't an issue. And even though I knew I would never hurt kids, I would never perpetrate, I would never be that way, I didn't know others would feel that way about me. It took me a while before I could feel safe to share what happened to me just because I didn't know what others would think of me.
What was the turning point for you? You said it took a long time. When did that break free? What happened?
It was very gradual, little steps at a time. I shared with a few people here and there, and it wasn't until I actually shared in church, I gave my testimony in church, that I really felt like I was free of the shame, because I know that God had healed me and that I knew where I stood with God, and that is where I was defined. It wasn't by what happened to me, but where I stood. Until that point, I would share with a few people, like, today, there were a few people that knew that I was a survivor, and there was at least one or two of them knew I did this podcast, but I didn't want to bring it up at this gathering because, it's not a fun subject, but I'm not afraid to share with any of them. It's just that wasn't the time. But so I was very careful for quite a while, and I still am, obviously, but it wasn't until I actually gave my testimony in church. What brought that on was by being healed by God taking that burden of shame off of me and making me realize that I was not defined, and that wasn't who I was. Who I was a child of God, that I had a purpose, that I had a gift, and that He wanted me to share that gift. And that's when I felt like I was no longer ashamed of who I was.
Thank you, Kevin. Now, Luke's kind of new in this process of the sharing. What would you say about telling your story, Luke?
The first time I actually shared my story was, I believe it was my mom. And when I told her, she cried. And I wouldn't say reverted, but I stopped telling people for a really long time. And now I say I'm more comfortable with it. I'm very cautious. I'm still at that point. Do I trust myself around other people's children? Not necessarily. I don't think I'm gonna harm them. That's not me. I'm not gonna do what happened to me to someone else's child. But there's still that fear that is there. And with that fear and that, there's still shame too. With that, there's that extra careful of, do I really want to be around this person's child? Or if they find out what happened to me, are they going to think that I'm going to do this to their child? That scares me. There's adults at work that I have no problem telling, and know that they don't have any problem with me being around their children, but there's still that fear, there's still that shame.
Yeah, which shows us it is a process. And thank you for being so honest about that, because one of the two things, one is we hear if they only knew, right? And the other thing is this podcast, and when we talk, we educate people, because so many times I've heard people say, well, abusers re-abuse. That's not true. Many of our criminals were abused. That's a true fact, but not everybody who is abused re-abuses. Mike, I saw you had something to say.
Yeah. The other hard part is when you do start sharing your story, and I've shared it in different places in my church community, so I know most of the leaders, most of the active people in my church do know my story. When you get faced with rejection, especially when it comes to working with children, it's like, is it just because I'm not qualified, or is it because of my story? And I have faced some rejection, and you don't know, especially if they just say, oh, I think we're going to go a different way this year. It's like, oh, okay. And you don't know. Yeah, it sucks. But yeah.
Another aspect. Thank you.
Right.
That's really important. Luke, I saw you wanting to say something.
Yeah, to touch on something you had said, actually, Lori, that a lot of the criminals in our system are survivors. And that was not something I had realized until I actually had gone to prison. When I first entered and I found out how many people in there were actually survivors, it broke my heart to know that. And then they obviously they're going to put us in with people who perpetrate these crimes as well, and we're all angry already because we're survivors, and we don't want to be around somebody that's going to do that to a child. So what do? For the most part, those guys just honestly, they stayed in their cells because they were afraid. You hear the stories of what happens to sex offenders in jail, and most of that honestly is true, because like you said, most of the people that are in there are survivors of this. And they don't know most of them don't know how to deal with it. Honestly, I didn't know how to deal with it when I finally realized that what had actually happened to me was rape. I didn't know how to deal with it other than get messed up. And that's all I wanted to do was numb myself, honestly. I just wanted to be numb because I didn't want to feel that pain anymore. So that's what I did. And, to know that there's guys still locked up that have this and they have no resources. They can't deal with it like I'm dealing with it. So they deal with it in their own way. Yeah. But,
Luke asked me one time about what kind of stuff he could do to give back. And I just think I heard his passion just now. Imagine if those people in prison, which we interviewed Dan, who was also in prison, and it didn't come out about his child abuse. He knew about it, but he didn't talk about it until his second time into rehab. But imagine if people in prison had, like you said, the resources, the opportunity to tell that story. Now you're going to be in a room with a bunch of men and be vulnerable and tell your story. That's not going to fly, but there may be a way if somebody came in one-on-one that once we all want to feel heard, we all want to be seen. And, that's what is so missing. And so often people don't or can't or don't know they can tell their story. And telling the story it takes away the power, but it gives you empowerment.
It just shows how we've failed the people that are victims. I hate to use that word, but until they realize that they can be healed, until they realize that they have resources, that there are resources, they are victims. And we don't become survivors until we start taking care of ourselves, until we start standing up for ourselves. And so many men never do, because you have to first say that we have been hurt, and men don't like to admit being hurt. And that's, especially if you're in prison, you're not going to admit that you've ever been hurt because you can't be vulnerable. And being vulnerable is so hard for a man. But most of us, we were abused at young ages when we had no control, when we had no, we weren't able to do anything about it. And yet when we're older, we feel like we can't admit that happened. But until we do, until we realize that, yes, we have to stand up for ourselves, we're just going to continue. And the easiest way to be, to get out of it is to find some way to numb yourself, to, cope with. And most of our coping mechanisms aren't very healthy. There aren't very many coping mechanisms that help you in your healing. Most of them tend to continue the numbing.
Think about the opioid issue and all the drug problems. Imagine if we got to the core, right? Rather than just get off drugs, if we got to the core, it might change the whole recovery community. And I got to interview Amanda Knox a little while ago. And I said, how did you get from victim to survivor? And what she said is, I had to look it full in the face. I had to look at everything and face it and stop numbing. And that's when you become the survivor. One thing she said is, in prison, she saw those people, even though they had done bad things, she saw their humanity. And I think that's kind of what Luke was talking about. You're all, in prison and you've all been hurt, and yet there's still a kind of a category. And I'm just hoping that with this podcast, some things will come out of that to help people that are still really suffering and numbing. Mike?
I wanted to add my numbing methods were eating, for one, and also pornography, sex addiction, that kind of stuff. And I am in a support group now for that. And the leader, he says, you need to bless the addiction, bless the fact that we were doing it. It wasn't necessarily evil. It helped numb us, helped us survive to bring us to a place where we could finally confront the pain. And so you can honor that. And it's a wonderful place because that has tons of shame as well. And you can honor that addiction because it helped to numb the pain until you could face the pain.
Yeah, I think
I love that.
We are gifted with ways of coping, and even though I said most of those coping methods don't work well, they do work. And they work as far as they keep us alive, because I hated myself for a long time. I thought I was basically doomed. And yet when I was doing drugs, doing alcohol, doing all those things that just got me through, and it took me a long time. I'm a slow learner. But yes, I honor that I did survive. And also I didn't end up in jail because I was capable enough of doing all those things and staying out of trouble. Not all of us do. And that's why a lot of men end up in jail, because they're doing things to cope, but those things aren't necessarily legal. And so they end up in jail. And because they're just trying to cope with what they're dealing with, they end up in jail. And then they're not given any resources. Like Luke was saying, there's nothing there for them. And so what are they taught? They're taught other coping mechanisms, but they're not necessarily helping them to get through the process. They're not. And that's why I think we have really failed victims, in that we're not addressing why they're doing these things to cope. We're just penalizing them for coping.
Yeah. We talked about different ways of coping: drugs, alcohol, pornography, sex addiction. We've, covered a lot in the show. For me, it was dissociating. So I knew how to go bye-bye, and I had to work very hard on staying present. And so for me, that was my coping. And there is shame in that as well, because, I had little kids, and sometimes it would be 2:00 and then it would be 4:00. And I don't know where those 2 hours went. But I love what you said, Mike, how bless that thing that saved our life, because that's what saves our life. And then that we can admit it, talk about it, and not let it become the next shame, right? We get rid of one shame and then we latch onto another, but that we can totally be free. And it doesn't mean we're not going to be tempted. It doesn't mean we're not going to have issues. I know, like with some of the people in recovery, they're like, life's good now, everything's going to be great. And I'm like, oh, sorry. Still going to be issues. But when you're not numbing, you can cope better with these kind of issues. So we have about 15 minutes left. Is there anything that we haven't covered that feels important about shame? I feel like we've really covered a big area that's going to touch a lot of people, because everybody deals differently. And I think that's what people want to hear. They're like, well, I didn't do that. Oh, but I did that. Right. And so hopefully this kind of panel is giving people permission to look at who they are, what they're doing, and be able to get help and find self-love.
I think for me, a big deal is the shame isn't as big as you think it is. For me, once I started feeling safe sharing, and then once I realized people don't react the way you are afraid they will. I mean, I think our fear is magnified by the shame, and then the shame magnifies the fear, and then the fear it's this cycle of, it just goes out of control. But when you do share, most people want to be supportive. Most people don't assume the worst in you, especially if they know you. So don't be as afraid of the shame at first, because you will be surprised. People want to be supportive. They don't always know how. And that's what was the big thing for me, is people don't always all know how to support you or reassure you, or they want to overdo it, or, they want to throw that person in jail or something like that. But generally, they're not going to judge you in the way that you're afraid of. That's not always true, but for the most part, people will, especially if they know you, they will cut you some slack and say, wow, I didn't know that. You've been through a lot. Wow, that's amazing that you've gone through this and you're able to talk about it. Most people are just genuinely surprised that you are able to talk about it. And that's where shame loses its power, is when you realize people aren't going to judge you necessarily or as harshly as you think they will.
Yeah. Luke?
I think for me, it's facing the shame, and like Kevin was saying, I've gotten a spectrum of different reactions, and none of them were really negative. Just a lot of them were like, I've gotten, I want to give you a hug, which I'm not a hugging person, but if they want to give me a hug, okay. To wow, you've been through a lot. I don't know how you did it. I don't think I could do it. I don't think I could survive that. It's about, for me, it was about facing my shame, dealing with that shame, and accepting. Acceptance is for me was key to all of it. Just accepting that, this is what I have and it's something I gotta deal with. Mm-hmm. I don't like it. Yeah. It's a horrible thing that happened, but I accept that. Oh, and forgiveness as well. Mm-hmm. I've forgiven the person that did this to me.
Awesome. Mike, you had something?
Yes, as I've been going through this journey, I've learned that shame actually stunts and hinders our recovery. That so much of the recovery process is digging in and trying to figure out, okay, why am I doing certain things? Why do I react certain ways? And if you dig into those things, you can get healed from those things. You can find the source of those things. And shame blocks that. One of the first retreats I went to with Men Healing, a weekend of recovery for male survivors, they said shame and curiosity cannot coexist. So, and curiosity, a healthy curiosity, is so key in your recovery, because you have to figure out, oh, why do I do things that way? Why am I drawn to this particular issue or this particular numbing method? And like with pornography for men, okay, why do I type in these words in the search bar and not other words? And it takes that healthy curiosity to dig down and see, oh, this is from because this happened and this happened. That's why I react this way. And it takes a healthy curiosity to be able to go there. And shame cancels that out.
We're out of time, but that is such a brilliant ending. And as a coach, I'm all about asking questions and being curious, but I'd never heard that the shame blocks that. And I think if that's something that we can take away from this, that it's so worth facing the shame, because it is blocking us from so many natural things that we would be doing. So we will do this panel again on another subject, because this has been so fantastic. But I had two things that we're going to close in prayer. But first, I want to go around and I want you to I'm a big one on not giving advice, but I feel like with this, just what's one word of advice? Somebody's listening. They haven't told their story. They're full of shame. What's a word of advice? Let's start with Luke.
A word of advice, acceptance.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, the more you share your story, the more comfortable you are, and the more you can overcome the shame. And no, it was not your fault.
Yeah, thanks. Kevin?
I love that Luke answered with one word, which is like you said, a word of advice. And I'm like, I can't do it in one word. And then you said acceptance, and I'm like, wow, he did it. I would say realize that you do matter and that the shame doesn't define you.
Thank you. This has been so great. I appreciate your honesty, your vulnerability, you guys. I know this is a big deal, and I'm looking forward to more of these. And we always give people a chance to jump off if prayer isn't their thing, but we do like to wrap up in prayer. And so I'm going to sit this one out, because this is kind of the men's panel. So Kevin, I'll let you take care of that. And anyone who wants to follow him, feel free.
So that's it for today.
We are going to have a prayer time if you want to stick with us. If not, we believe in you.
We want to hear from you. We want to hear your stories.
If you like this podcast, please rate and review, because that's how other people can find us. And we really want to spread this message.
Father, I thank you for these men, and I thank you for anyone who's listening, that you would bless their lives and guide them, Lord. Guide them to knowing their purpose, and that you have a purpose for them, and that you want them to heal. You want them not to be ashamed, because you're not ashamed of them, but you know their hearts, and that you love them regardless of what happened to them. You love them, and you want them to know how much you love them, Lord. And I pray that they would come to know that they don't have to be ashamed, that they have a purpose, and that they deserve to be healed. There is a way for them to be healed, that they don't have to suffer and hide, that they can find the healing they deserve and help others too, that their voices need to be heard, Lord. I just pray that you would help them to know that when they speak about what has happened to them, it will help others to speak about it and help them to heal, and that they're doing that so that other men can also find their voices and come to healing. Lord, I just pray for Mike and Luke, and for Mike's wife, for her healing, and for Luke's healing in this process, and his amazing strength right now, and for what his heart is to help others. Lord, I'm just so thankful that he has been willing to share his story and to be open about his path and his healing. And I pray for his continued journey in helping others, that by being open about it, by sharing with others, by his book, that he will help other men to find that they don't have to hide, that they don't have to continue to suffer, that they can also heal. And I pray for Mike that he would continue to have a strong voice and be a powerful leader in his community, and he would continue to share his story, and that would benefit others. Lord, I just thank you that you have given these men the strength to be vulnerable and help others. I thank you, Lord, in your name.
Father, thank you for Lori and for Kevin and this ministry with this podcast. Pray you will continue to use it to reach out to others who are hurting, Lord, and that it can be a beacon of hope to those people out there who deal with so much pain and shame from being victims and survivors of this epidemic in our society, Lord. And pray for those listening to know that they can overcome those feelings of shame because you love them, and there is no need for guilt or shame, Lord, that you love them. If you had a refrigerator, their picture would be on it, Lord. And because you just love us so much, Lord, we are your children, and you desire that relationship. Lord, just pray that you would help those people, men and women listening, to know that they can come to you, that you mourn that pain that they experience, Lord, and you so desire to help guide them through their recovery, through their healing journey, Lord, that you didn't cause the pain, that you knew it happened, but because of free will, these things happen in an evil world. But help them to know that you are right there, wanting to love them and support them, Lord. And just thank you for how you blessed all of us, Lord, and continue to heal us.
Lord, I ask you to be with these men and with Lori. Bless them. And bless this ministry. I thank you for this ministry, Lord. It's a beacon of hope. I ask you to be with those who are still struggling and who are still victims. Be with those who are still going through this, who are still being abused. Bless them, Lord. Keep them. I ask you to be with Mike's wife. Help her heal. Amen.
Amen.
No longer ashamed. Thank you guys so much.